Ready? Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to Rushcliffe Borough Council's Growth and Development Scrutiny Group meeting. I'd like to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. In addition, under the relevant regulations, other people may film, record, tweet, or blog from this meeting. The use of any such images or sound recordings is not under the Council's control. May I remind councillors to please switch off your microphones when you're not speaking. Thank you. And we have a number of officer and guests in attendance with us tonight. Catherine Evans, Service Manager at Economic Growth and Property. Leanne Ashmore, Director of Development and Economic Growth. Cara Prendergast, Corporate and Commercial Projects Officer. Richard Mapletoft, Planning Policy Manager. Your job title isn't down here. I don't want to promote you or demote you. Okay, very good. Callum Smith, Nottinghamshire County Council. Robin Waddell and Adam Ralph from Greenbelt. Thank you, everybody, for accommodating the earlier start as well. Can definitely confirm that that's in order for us to have enough time to discuss the important item on the agenda, and nothing to do with wanting to get home before the darts finishes with Mr. Waddell. And any relation? Yeah. No. Okay. Well, anyway, enough of the darts. Let's move on to the agenda. The first item being apologies for absence.
We have apologies from Councillor Solomon, and substituting is Councillor Phillips.
And are there any declarations of interest? We've had the minutes of the previous meeting. Are we happy that they're an accurate record of the discussion? Very good then. So without further ado, let's move on to the substantive items. So the first item being management of open spaces. There are 5 recommendations for us to consider. I won't read them out, but just in terms of approach here, we're going to have a presentation from Cara, followed by another presentation from Greenbelt. Then I think the intention is to have a period of sort of questions and answers before we go on to the consideration of the recommendations sequentially. So Cara, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Councillor Walker. So I'm going to share a brief presentation with you this evening. I won't. I'll keep it very brief so that we've got time for a presentation from colleagues from Greenbelt and also for a good opportunity for discussion. So if you don't mind, Catherine, thank you. So just an overview of what I'm going to be discussing this evening in the next kind of 10 or so minutes. So just a reminder really of the background and why we're here this evening. Spending a bit of time talking about residents' concerns around the management of open spaces, talking about what's happening nationally, because I think probably everyone's aware that it's not a unique issue to Rushcliffe, and then what we are proposing our role is as a local authority, which is detailed in the report, and then passing over to colleagues from Greenbelt. So I think probably this is information that most of us are aware of. So prior to 2000, the council adopted all open space. There was no cost to developers and no cost to residents. And then between 2000 and 2011, the council adopted open space, but with a commuted sum from developers, which provided funding for the maintenance of open spaces for 15 years, after which time we were responsible for the maintenance and the finance of that. And then as of 2011, the council no longer adopts open spaces. So developers, house builders have to submit an open space scheme as part of their planning application. And that requires them to kind of set out their method for securing management and maintenance of open spaces, which is generally via a management company. And it's probably worth saying that this is kind of the move that most local authorities across the country took. So it's not unique to Rushcliffe, that approach. And historically, the council hasn't had a great deal of involvement with developers or management companies around the management of open spaces, kind of post-planning. So that's where we are today. So residents' concerns. So I think there clearly have been historically a number of issues in relation to management company practices, and residents have expressed concerns to us. So we've kind of broadly captured those under these three themes. So transparency and fairness. The examples I've listed here, they're not comprehensive. There'll be examples that aren't listed, but this generally seems to be the kind of key information that's been fed back to us. So historically, residents have said they have been unaware of the extent of the fees that they would have to pay. So I think most people were aware that they would be paying some fee to a management company, but actually the extent of those fees and the kind of intricacies of that, people weren't always aware of. That fees are not always related to open spaces. So there's examples where residents have had to pay fees if they wanted an extension on their home, fees if they wanted to remortgage. So things that aren't kind of, we talk about open spaces, but actually it's not exclusively around open spaces. There's a kind of suggestion from some residents that there's a lack of fairness, that open spaces and facilities are in these developments paid for by the residents of those developments, but actually they're public, so they can be used by anybody. So there's a perception that perhaps that's not fair. And then in terms of transparency, some residents have felt that there isn't sufficient detail. So they're presented with a bill, and actually it's lacking in detail, and they're not happy to pay, without sufficient information. So the second kind of theme around residents' concerns is the quality of the maintenance that's been carried out. So there's examples that we've heard of where reportedly work has been carried out poorly, or work hasn't been carried out at all, where residents have expected it to happen on a particular schedule and it's not happened. A kind of second similar issue around quality of maintenance is reports of staged handovers. So developers haven't handed over the open space in one go, and a management company can take it and maintain it. So there's kind of two kind of organisations operating on the same development at the same time, and that can be kind of confusing, understandably, for residents. And then a third theme is around poor customer service and no right to challenge or hold to account. So residents have struggled on occasion to resolve their issues with management companies, and because they don't have the same kind of legal rights as leaseholders, they don't have access to redress schemes or an ombudsman service. Although I've put a note there that I think often what we've heard is that residents feel like the management company is there and they've got no opportunity to seek an alternative, and a number of management companies that we've spoken to have told us that actually there are clauses in there which do allow residents to take over responsibility themselves if they chose to, although that obviously comes with its own complications and challenges, but it is an option for residents, so just worth popping in there. That's a very quick run through residents' concerns. Obviously there's examples that aren't referenced here, but hopefully that captures the themes really. So what's happening nationally? So I think, from what I understand, this has been a very long time coming, but in November 23, the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Bill was introduced to Parliament, and the first sitting of the public committee is going to be on the 16th of January, and the committee is scheduled to report back by the 1st of February. So a long time coming, but hopefully we'll see a bit more information coming through relatively soon. So that Leasehold and Freehold Reform Bill covers a multitude of things, but one element of it is around granting freehold homeowners on private estates the same rights of redress as leaseholders. So they will be able to take their cases to tribunal, and they'll have access to ombudsman service. So that is that would be a significant change for residents living on these estates with management companies, if they feel they are not getting the service, or the estate charges aren't reasonable, etc. They have access to a kind of a process which is set out in law, which they don't currently have. And then a second kind of development nationally is the New Homes Quality Board and Code. So the board is an independent, not-for-profit organisation, and it's established to oversee the quality of new homes and customer service. So again, like the Reform Bill, it covers all things to do with the building of new homes. but a significant element of it is around ensuring that developers provide very clear and accurate information to new home buyers about what they can expect in terms of the role of the management company and the fees they will be paying to the management company. And they will get an indicative cost schedule, so they'll know exactly what to expect as far as is reasonable. Interestingly, so developers will be required to make sure that customers know they should appoint an independent legal advisor when buying a new home. So we had heard instances, which I think are probably quite historic now, of developers recommending their own kind of associated firms to provide legal support. So ensuring that developers are making sure that homeowners are appointing independent legal advisors so that they can make sure they're made aware of all of these different fees and obligations. And new homeowners will have access to an ombudsman service for 2 years after the completion of that sale. So the board, well, the code rather, so developers are encouraged to sign up to it. It's non-compulsory, but as far as we're aware, 90% of all medium and large house builders in the UK are signed up to it. So it's obviously, developers are keen to sign up. So that's what's happening, the two kind of really significant things that are happening nationally. So I suppose this is what we really are here to talk about. What is our role? So hopefully you can see in the report that we've explored a number of avenues to see. I think we acknowledge that there is a role for us in ensuring that our residents have a better experience, but our powers in terms of planning powers are very limited. But we can see a much clearer role for ourselves as a facilitator and encouraging good practice, which is something we haven't proactively done in the past. So what we're looking to do, and this role, I think, will probably become more clear as we work more closely with developers and management companies. But what we're looking at currently is building closer relationships with developers and management companies at an earlier stage than we have historically. Inviting management companies to attend our growth and development board. So for our large developments, so for example, Fareham and Bingham, the management companies there will, we hope, be sitting on that board so that we can work and establish our expectations at a really early stage. And I think probably really important to acknowledge that lots of what I've spoken about this evening is kind of forward looking, but obviously there are lots of residents who pay their fees to management companies who won't necessarily benefit from things like the new homes quality code. So what we're keen to do is find a way of supporting residents groups to make contact with management companies and facilitate some initial meetings so that they can, have their issues heard properly. And then lastly, something that we are going to be exploring this year is the development of a good practice code. So probably something similar to the new homes quality code, but more locally focused. That will never be able to be a kind of mandatory document or something that we can enforce, but it's something that we can, in these really early conversations, encourage developers to sign up to and work with them to make sure that it's an appropriate code and an appropriate ask. So I think it's fair to say that it's a complex landscape and it requires a lot of different parties to kind of play their role. So for national government to do their part in terms of legislating and for developers and management companies to do their part in terms of operating transparently. But there certainly is a significant role for us to play in terms of influencing and facilitating. And that's something that we are committed to kind of growing over the next 12 months and seeing where our role can become kind of more proactive than it has been historically. So that's all that I was going to touch on in terms of the presentation. So I was proposing now to hand over to our colleagues at Greenbelt before colleagues on the scrutiny group discuss.
Yeah, thank you very much. So who's going first?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Perfect. Is that yeah, perfect. So Greenbelt Group, we've been operating for the last 25 years in the UK. Principally, the company initiated from public sector. It was a spin out from Strathclyde Regional Council. It was a small action group that was set up to deal with development on the urban fringe within the Strathclyde conurbation. but that was mid-90s. Then when the regional councils disbanded, the unit spun out and then fulfilled a dual role working with local planning authority or local authorities and private sector. And then slowly over a period of time, it became fully autonomous. So Greenbelt's main focus was establishing new woodlands within that urban fringe and around new development to soften the impact, visual impact, and bringing back into management existing woodlands. So the company or the organisation was predominantly filled with foresters, arboricultural trained staff, and then started to branch out from the Strathclyde region into other areas within Scotland and Northern England. And as a result of that, we're taking on new work and new projects, which involve not just looking after establishing woodlands, but public open space, amenity open space. So that then meant that the company had to evolve, bring in specialists who had expertise in landscape open space management, and the adoption of play areas became a feature as well. So the company started off from a fairly simple concept to one that had started to evolve, taking on more complex open space. And we've seen open space just generally become more complex over the last 20 years. So originally, most housing developments just had simple grass, tree and shrubs. And then what we saw in the mid-90s up to late 90s, the predominance of structural woodland or buffer open space. And then we saw the introduction of play equipment. Local planning authorities or local authorities were not that willing to take them on, and conditioning developers to install them within their developments. So we then saw a predominance of them, and then in the early 2000s, the introduction of sustainable urban drainage systems became a feature. So slowly, public open space has become much more complex and carries more risk. And now, with the onset of biodiversity net gain, that adds an extra layer of complexity onto developments as well. So the way Greenbelt used to fund, so initially, like a lot of local planning authorities, our funding mechanism was quite crude, actually, based on our experience as a spin out from local authorities. So we predominantly adopted sites using commuted sums and continued to offer that service to developers where it was required. But we sort of slowly built in. We realised that actually on many sites it was actually quite difficult to ring fence and predict when works, or certainly exceptional or non-routine works, were going to be required. So it was quite difficult to budget. The best way we felt to smooth out those budget concerns and make sure that we were in funds in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years time, 50 years time, was to provide, to allow the end user to provide a contribution, i.e. the residents on the site. And that was far more sustainable because you then guarantee an income stream on that site in perpetuity. And that income stream, certainly with regards to our models, run with the land, not with the company. So whoever has title has the right to collect. And we've always allowed or encouraged step-in rights for any local authority if they so wish, or any water authority or public body or statutory body that felt that if they needed control of a certain part of the site or a feature, they could. So that allowing income streams to be guaranteed gave us more comfort. Relying on commuted sums was tricky. So we've slowly phased them out, so we don't take them on anymore using that method. And also, what's expedited that is the fact that interest rates have also increased hugely as well. So that's meant that holding a lump sum that's usually a 25 or 30-year multiplier, if you're doing really well, that's fine. That guarantees you to 30 years. But then after that, you've got to think on your feet. So for that reason, we've taken a step back from that. So Greenbelt then moved out into the northeast of England, Northern Ireland, and then into the Midlands 15 years ago. And so we've been and further south and in South Wales. So we've been adopting open space and a whole variety of amenity open space, predominantly on residential sites for that that period of time. And we enjoy it. Every site is different. Every site has its own issues that we resolve. We've got standard forms of agreement with developers that we can flex to suit the nature of the site, and different styles of agreement and contract to suit the scale of the site too. So yeah, we don't, and so because we take now, the way we differ as a business is that we tend to take a longer term interest on the site. So we predominantly take ownership, but that now varies. We now take a long lease, and with that mindset, we tend to drill into the detail of the site to make sure that the site, that we're not going to inherit a liability. So we take great care in ensuring that we are going to adopt the site in good order, that there is no abnormal situations beneath the ground. And also we don't inherit any planning issues or conditions or obligations that haven't been discharged. So, and also so that gives us the opportunity to then implement long-term management plans that we are now seeing on most of these sites. So habitat management plans, long-term ecological plans as well. They often require a 5, 10-year, 15-year plan. And that allows us to get in and manage them. It allows the developer to step away, and it allows us to get to know the developers, the residents as well. We've now built into our contracts with developers the right for residents to step away. They always have that right. So all our residents and all our sites in the UK, we have over 74,000 that we're currently billing plots throughout the UK. They all have the right to end the arrangement, and it's called consumer options, and that's the details of that are sent to all our residents throughout the UK annually, and it's also detailed on our website. But on most of our portfolio, that wasn't a formal right or a legal right, even though we offer it up. But what we're doing now is offering it as a legal right, so it's built into the residents' TP1s that they have that right, and we encourage a 5-year term that allows us to get in, properly establish it, properly vet the site, make sure that it's fully compliant, all the open spaces are laid out properly and not randomly. And then that ensures that we can then, and that 5-year period allows us to get the site properly established. And then if the residents, if they so wish, they can choose to take control and go a different course if they wish. And that's absolutely fine. So that's roughly in a nutshell how we operate and where we operate.
Thank you. So, yeah, would you mind? The pen that I've already borrowed has just run out. Thank you very much, Rob. It's interesting to hear both about the context and how things are operating currently. Just before we invite questions from other members of the committee, could you just explain in a bit more detail what the procedure is for the resident opt out, if you like, or presumably buy in a sense? How could you just flesh that out for us a little bit more? How would it work? Has it worked previously? And I think we'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about that.
Sorry, again. So the residents all, so we agree that housing developers will go out to tender, choose a provider. If we are lucky enough to be appointed, we will then issue a draft contract to a house builder, and along with that, a draft TP1 wording section. So, and that wording in order for the arrangement to work and to guarantee equity throughout the site in terms of payment, everyone paying, it then also reaffirms it explains the residents, our obligation to the residents as well. That's sent to the house builder, then it's up to the house builder to make sure that it's integrated into their TP1. We get to proof that as well. So And then the developer, once we've approved that, the developer's in a position to start selling plots. If the developer's already sold lots of plots, without that wording, it's very difficult for us to get involved. If it's just a few plots, we can work with it and try and work it back. So that's the first stage completed. The next stage is to make sure that our contract with the house builder is concluded as well, and that spells out all the requirements that the house builder needs to do in order to pass the site to us. It also there's usually specifications and schedules attached to it which spell out what obligations are on Greenbelt to manage the site. And then the last stage is the disposition, the transfer to Greenbelt. So once everything is laid out and everything is fully compliant and all houses sold, then the transfer of ownership process can happen. And then that's the third and final process that the developer has to go through. We don't need to have that. Title doesn't need to be transferred before we can start engaging with the residents. We can so the contract that we have, the middle part of the process with the developer, allows us to step on and start adopting open space under license. So we can operate on the developer's behalf until all the open spaces are fully built out, laid out. And once we've made sure that all the due diligence has been carried out and we're comfortable that all planning obligations are discharged, we're then in a position to take ownership. But that process can take months. It can take a couple of years, 3 years. But we don't want to wait until that process is complete before we take access, because the open spaces need to be maintained and the open spaces are being used. So we will then, the agreement, the legal contract allows us to occupy or take access. We can take a phased access, and then we can start managing the open spaces until such time as we've got a transfer.
Sorry, I don't think I was clear. Did I understand correctly that if residents want to self-manage later down the line, you've afforded them a right or an option or potentially a legal right in some cases to do that? That's the bit I'm keen to understand how that process would look.
Yeah. So they've got a right. All residents have a right for, and it's called community options. And that's on our site because the vast majority of our sites in the UK, Greenbelt own, but there isn't a legal right for the residents to take it. And we've said no, that the residents can take it. We won't stand in their way at all. They can, and it's all detailed in their written statement of service that they get. So when they get their annual bill, they get a breakdown, but on the back of that bill details everything that we do on the site. It details payment options, their rights as consumers, a whole array of various safeguards to protect their interests as residents and end users. It also details our obligations as well, but it also details their right to end the arrangement if they so wish. And that's on our website too, so they can do it. And some resident groups have entertained it and looked at it. And I think in the last 15 years, we've had one group of residents determined, and it's determined enough to do it. We had one who took on a site in Dunbar in East Lothian about 12 years ago. They took it on, and then after 6 months, they asked us to step back on because they couldn't get them. They hadn't fully understood the complexity and the enormity of what we were taking on. So that should, we hope, give residents comfort that they're not locked in. However, on all our new sites, we've given it an actual explicit legal right, so they have that right to trigger that whenever they want. And there's certain criteria they need to fulfil. I think we asked for a 51% majority, which shouldn't be that hard to achieve. We also ask for consent by the local planning authority, or local authority have consented it as well. And also we've got to make sure that debt is also recovered as much as possible. There'll be some debt that we won't be able to recover entirely, and we'll take a view, but we wouldn't want to stand in their way to do that.
Other questions? Comments? Do you want to go first?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the officers here know that I'll be the one with loads of questions. I'm on 3 pages so far. I just want to go back to the beginning of this, really, and the idea of open space. And I'd like to know how you define open space, because this has been sold to purchasers and is still being referred to in that way to purchasers. And comments from residents and the occasional mystery shopper, I have to say, come back that they're told it's open space. Oh, it's okay. It's only a bit of mowing or a bit of hedge cutting, and it'll be about £100 a year. So they go away quite happily with that idea that £100 a year isn't too much to pay for that. But they're unaware that there's a charge on their house. I know we're going to come back with this, that they should know, buyer beware and all that sort of thing. But there's been some inconsistencies about the advice they've had. They're unaware that it covers the playgrounds, the suds and various other things. They're unaware as well that further down the road, they could be sent huge bills for things like fly tipping and so on. And I think we've got a whole ranch of residents who are now in a position where they are financially scared. They feel threatened. I've heard that word used to me, that I feel threatened. And it's taking a huge financial and emotional and mental toll on these people. Now, I'm obviously speaking about people who are already in these properties and have been for some years, probably going back to when you started in this area. And they're finding it very difficult to find any way to communicate and any redress. Now, we've been promised from our local MP that the new bill going through Parliament will allow retrospective redress to these sorts of things. But the new house builder, home builders, code, yes, actually specifically says that it only applies if you buy your house after the developer has registered. So we've still got a huge tranche of people in a very difficult position. And I'd like to hear from you how, and I use the term you as a representative management agent, so I'm not just the one managing agent, but I want to know what plans you have or what you can do to help these people who are stuck. The Competition and Markets Authority report described people in these sorts of situations as subset. And I think now, because the rules are changing, we're going to have a subset of people stuck, sometimes unable maybe to sell their properties and things. So I really think it's important that we have somebody like yourself looking at how we can help those people. Sorry, long question.
Yeah, well, we're aware that some residents, well, there's a large variety. We saw this on just pre-COVID and after COVID, some residents struggling to pay, and we've always given them payment options and flexible payment options. We do, as any organisation, need to encourage residents to contribute, and we can't let it drift. So, but then we do have a small minority of how. So we've got actually a very good payment rate. So 97% of all our bills get paid within the first 3 months. But there is a 3% where there's serial non-payers, and we have to manage that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the residents on a lot of we give residents an opportunity to engage in what because we take ownership, we then have full liability. So we can't just walk away if things get messy or difficult. If the residents want us to walk away, then we will start that process. So, and we can't have a situation where residents will withhold payment, and they're entitled to withhold payment through their TP1. We still have to maintain the site as owners. We will still be required to manage it, maintain it, because if we don't, we're in breach of planning and we will be enforced. So it's not in our interest to hike charges, because if we have that, we're on a sticky wicket ourselves. So we've got to be very careful. Now, it does, unfortunately, from time to time, there will be periods where some unforeseen non-routine work is required to repair something, or if there's been excessive storm damage, and that does come at a cost that we didn't predict, the residents didn't predict. So now sometimes we will have to then contra-charge that back to the residents, but on many occasions we've absorbed the cost ourselves, and we've actually spread that payment over a number of years to try and soften the blow to some residents groups when that's occurred. It tends not to happen that often, but when it does, it can be a shock. So we've got to be very careful about how we treat our residents. We know they're there, we hope, for a decent period of time. We don't want to jeopardise the relationship. Yes, we will get the odd resident who's determined to be a different path or want to do something different or object, and we will try and reason with them and work with them to find a solution that may suit them best. But on the whole, we find that the majority of residents work with us, understand what we're trying to do, and we have quite good, very good systems in place to make sure the sites are well supervised. And then and vetted, so any external structures or site-specific structures like play equipment or SUDs get independently vetted. But occasionally there will be a requirement to renew an item, like an item of equipment. That's not so bad, but occasionally we've had one or two occasions where a play area has been completely vandalised at once, and that is a big expenditure. General wear and tear and isolated items or features or head walls on a drainage system can be dealt with and absorbed within the residents' bills quite comfortably. So, and our bills compared to, so on average, our bills are about £140 ex VAT across all our sites in the UK. Comparing that with a resident in an apartment block where they could be paying £1,200, £1,400 pounds, and maybe on top of that an additional infrastructure charge for open spaces as well, it can get quite pricey. With that said, we still offer flexible payment options and direct debit payments to allow residents to pay as they see fit. Most pay upfront, a one-off payment.
Yes, thank you for that. I still wonder whose responsibility it is. Is it yours or the developer to ensure that right at the beginning the residents understand what you've just explained and that these charges can be levied at any time? And again, the anecdotal things that I hear are that if anybody queries a bill, they can get threatening letters, and I have examples of that, and a response that's a solicitor's bill for £25 for asking a question. Now, I'm not sure that might be from yours, but this is the sort of thing that we're facing.
I think it's difficult for sort of existing developments, but for historic development, for new developments, one of the issues we've got as a management company is the first contact with the new homeowner. Doesn't come till I get our first bill. So one thing we try and do is get all the house builders' sales teams. We do like a CPD type training session, so they provide as much detail as they can at the point of sale. That's the only influence we can have on the house builders' sales teams. If they're not passing on the detail in terms of what the bill includes, what it doesn't include, where the areas are, it becomes very difficult for us once we access the site, which could be 2 or 3 years after a house has been purchased, So I think what we can do as management companies is push harder at that point of sale and make sure house builder sales teams are giving all the information. And that's starting to happen. I think with biodiversity net gain, that's put a really good spotlight on early collaboration. So management companies are getting involved much earlier, pre-planning, really emphasising that the sales execs need to explain what biodiversity net gain is, what does it look like, what will it cost, along with what the play area is, where the boundaries are. So it's happening. I think in that point of sale, when the sales exec wants to get a sale, the house builder is excited about their new plot, all that information disappears, and it's how do we ensure that information is retained. I think Cara's point about independent legal advice is really crucial, because that will be pulled out by the buyer's solicitor, whereas at the minute, if they're going with a house builder's solicitor, it might just be sort of skimmed across. So again, hopefully these new sort of frameworks will help that information at point of sale.
Leanne.
Thank you. I was just going to add to that, that's one of the actions that we have put in the report, where we see the council's role speaking to the developer. So we recognise that when we are dealing with the planning side with a developer, that's a different team to the sales team. And so sometimes within an organisation with a developer, the message is diluted or not promoted as much by the sales team as it is with the promoter or the planning team. So that's an area that we think. So the answer to your question is it's the developer that has to tell the house buyer this information, and we recognise there's a bit of a gap there, which is one of the embedded in one of the recommendations that we would look to see how we engage with the developers to make sure that working with management companies that message is put in a primary position for home buyers, so that they're aware of it up front, so they can make an informed decision.
Thank you. Councillor Butler.
Thank you. I think I heard you say that you might levy an extra charge, for example, storm damage or wear and tear, etc., which comes as a bit of a surprise to me, to be honest, because I've not had a great deal of experience in management companies, and in fairness, the only one I've had dealings with is not yourselves; it's another one. But that leads me to my sort of observation or question, which is perhaps more for the authority, and that is the perception that we seem to be getting from residents who may or may not have been aware of the management charges, is the fact they still can't get their head around the fact that they're paying council tax as it is to the authority for the services wherever we live, we all get, and they can't necessarily see what extra they are getting for the management fees. They refer to things, again, I'm talking from, it's slightly parochial here, but things like replacement fence panels or just looking after play equipment, which is pretty much what the councils, all councils, county, borough and parish councils do already. So there must surely be some sort of communication role or whatever, or even some sort of policy to really look at this, because as was hinted in one of the slides, residents of these new developments can't necessarily get exclusive use of these developments. So there may well be people who live 50 yards down the road who live in a much older house, and the children come along and play on play equipment. So it does seem a little bit, it's a hard sell, isn't it, to sort of try and explain why it's right that there might be an extra charge for extra damages coming in, etc., for wind damage. So I don't know how we handle it, but I can see you're jumping to give me an answer.
I'm not necessarily jumping to give you an answer, because I agree it's a very challenging situation, and and that points to the one of Cara's points about the perception of fairness across new home owners and existing estates. Richard might be able to help me out, but with planning policy, there's been a huge shift over time and this is government-led policy about how much open space and facilities that should exist on new housing development. So if you sort of look at old estates, there's not a great deal of open space, and I think that's the difference between how the council were able to afford in the past to manage these bits of grass verge, very small areas of open space. All the drainage went into the main drainage systems. Now the sites need to hold their own drainage. It's much more complex a position compared with within the past. And if you sort of saw in the report, the council just can't afford to maintain that space in the way that it did historically, because it's different, a different type of open space and the complexity. So that doesn't answer your question in terms of fairness, because I'm not sure there is a satisfactory answer to that. It's the system that we have got today because of lots of different moving parts and factors that are now at play. The council has come to a conclusion that the example in the report about Fareham, if the council were to take that on without a community sum, that would be a minimum of £11 million. The council can raise council tax by 1%, and that equals 77,000. So you can just see that the maths don't add up. There's no physical way that the council could take on that land in order to create this sort of equitable access to space. So perhaps the answer is no. It doesn't feel equitable. It doesn't feel fair, because people are paying on new housing estates for facilities that can be used more broadly. And this circles back around to making sure that owners are aware of what they're buying when they buy into a new property. And I think there's been a gap in the past, and I think that's what we've discovered looking at this this project to come here today. And Cara and I have spent many months investigating it with all sorts of different partners, and there has been a gap with some house buyers who haven't recognised what they're buying into, and that's the problem. I think it comes from choice, but understanding what that choice is. But I think finding a solution that feels equitable is really challenging in the makeup of what we've got today, and how that differs to housing that was built 50 years ago, which didn't have anywhere near the amount of complex. I mean, we're calling it open space, but it's really not open space, is it? We've got all sorts of facilities on there that before were sort of provided by statutory bodies, and now they're not.
So I think the other element, when everything is working as it should, is the guarantee of quality and the protection of a maintenance specification. So if you've got a private management company, you're not, in theory, the quality of your site is not going to be affected by budget cuts where maybe landscape services get reduced from 10 grass cuts a year to 6 grass cuts a year. So in theory, when it works well, the quality of open space and green infrastructure should be consistent. And then also the issue around having to pay for non-routine requirements, as we call it. I think there is an option to do a sink fund. The issue is if you build up a large sink fund that doesn't get spent, people are then paying for something that never gets, if you don't have fly tipping, or you don't have tree damage, or you don't have play equipment to replace, there's a pot of money that, how do you allocate that? And if someone moves on to a new house, they ask for their sink fund back. So the non-routine approach to charging for a fly tip is, from our point of view, much more transparent and fair. You're basically paying for what services you have. I know what you're saying about that as a council service. Yeah, and that's, I suppose, we just end up going around in a loop on that basis. But in terms of a protected quality of service, I think a lot of house owners and buyers would, if they can guarantee their open space is maintained to a good standard for a fair price, I think quite a lot of people would be happy with that. It's just making sure that that's consistent throughout all management companies and in an unregulated sector. At the minute, it's sort of having to voluntarily regulate ourselves, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Grocock, next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where to start? I think I was past life I was an environmental development officer for Lambeth Council, spending Section 106 capital contributions to improve public parks. What a simple halcyon days that seemed compared to this postcode lottery, because that's what effectively it is. Depending on where you live, you're paying different sums for a completely different level of service. I'm not going to try and dismantle the entire system as it exists and rebuild it in my idealized utopia, because I don't think that's going to be productive. I take your point about the council can no longer simply afford to maintain the parks that it adopts. Well, the policy suggests that this open space is required, and it's a public open space that's required, but there's no way it can be paid for by the council as a whole through the council tax, because we can't raise enough council tax even with the additional housing. Fine, okay. I suppose I've got a few bits of questions here, so bear with me, please, Mr. Chairman. We're talking about the relationship between the council and the management company, and I think that importance of the principle of democratic accountability, even when a management company is managing open space on behalf of households, is really important. So what, I suppose, is my question in the recommendations, what is a more active role? Can we have some more details of what that might entail? What is greater transparency and governance? How would that actually work with reference to the relationship between the residents, the council, and the management company? And I'm not just talking about the legal powers or planning enforcement powers that the council has here. I'm talking about the soft power, you know, the partnership work, the ability to convene, the ability to bring people together to create visibility and transparency, etc. Related to that, though, to embed a standardized relationship, what's the possibility of the council? You know, you guys seem very socially minded. You seem very geared to, you've come out of the public sector. You seem very much like you want to do right by the residents which you serve. What's the possibility of the council having, through policy or whatever, some sort of term management company where that is that is our standard management company that we work with, because we recognise they're good, they've got a reputation that's good, they've got a strong relationship with the council, which creates greater democratic accountability and better visibility. So what's the opportunity of that? The other question is about minimising these arrangements, and it's an interesting point about having the requirement to provide open space within that new development. And I suppose this is maybe a planning policy question, Richard. And I'll use the example that's closest to me in my ward. The Aslaka Park development in Aslockton. Not everybody will be familiar with this, but it contains a tiny postage stamp open space which contains play equipment for children under the age of 6 months. Well, that's an exaggeration, but it's for very, very young children, effectively. I did ask at the time, as the funding officer for the Watton Aslockton Playing Field Trust, a charitable trustee made up of 2 parish councils, which manages the main open space of our village areas, if that, instead of putting an open space on that development, we could have an additional contribution to that playing field trust. One way of avoiding this potential postcode lottery, therefore, may be to actually try and invest in nearby open spaces more so, rather than creating open spaces under management companies on these estates, if that's possible. I'm asking the question, is it possible? I don't know, but it would seem to me that that would have been better, rather than creating a small space that A, only a small amount of residents are using, and B, is only of any use to a very small proportion of residents, because the play equipment is for a very young age group. Surely the collation of 8 play equipment in a single space for multiple ages would be better for families of the entire community and more consistent across the board. So that's a third question. And my final point is, if the council doesn't want to adopt these open spaces because it can't afford them, and we're accepting that point at face value as it is, why would it not allow adoption by parish councils that manage open spaces in lots of parts of our borough, or charitable trustees, or indeed existing residents groups that neighbour these new developments, which might expand to include the residents when they move into that? So is there a more socially minded adoption where other public bodies or charitable trustees or organisations that, let's say, have a more direct, obvious accountability to the public than a management company, greatest respect there, could be allowed to adopt? So that's my somewhat large 2 penneth worth.
I'm not quite sure how it starts to unpack that. There's a lot in there. Early on, we sort of talked about what the recommendations and how do we do this actually look like in practice. Perhaps if we pick off some of the other things around, could parish councils do it, and this, that, and the other. Okay. I'll get there, but I think it might be helpful for us to, after we've done that, turn our attention to the proposed actions at Appendix B, because that's, I think, where we get into the detail of how we're suggesting these things happen. But before we do that, Cara, do you want? Are you? Yeah.
So yeah, I shan't touch on the planning policy stuff, Richard. So you, yeah. So I suppose, so as you've suggested, Councillor Walker, my response to what is an active, what is and what active role, hopefully we've started to flesh out in Appendix B. I think I appreciate it's hard to get a handle on because we're still getting a handle on it. So working more closely with colleagues at Greenbelt, working more closely with developers than we have historically. Leanne has had countless conversations over the past few months to better understand it and build those relationships. Inviting developers and management companies to sit on the growth board. So invitations have already been extended to management companies to participate in the Fareham Growth Board and the Bingham Growth Board. So they'll be there, there'll be a seat at the table, and we'll be having those conversations, which we have never really had at that stage before. But I think it perhaps sounds woolly because we're still understanding it, and we're coming to scrutiny, not at the end of the journey, we're partway through the journey. But I think these kind of relationships that you can see are developing, it is a huge part of that. The question around, could we have, I'm not sure of the term used, but like a preferred management company. Yeah. I think the issue is, and you guys might want to comment on this, we don't have a role to play in appointing the management company. So we could work with a developer and say, this is what we, and this is part of, what we've referenced here, it possibly developing a good practice code. We could say to developers, this is what we would really, I don't think we'd ever be in a position to name this specific management company. We could say, this is what we would really like to see from the management company you're working with. Please, will you sign up to this code? And if you're not willing to, why? Is probably as far as we could go, but we certainly will be pushing in that direction. And then the issue around parish councils, I think probably, Leanne, you can expand on this, but you're going. So again, I think all that we can say to a developer, and Richard might want to add to this, is that there has to be an appropriate body there to manage an open space. So that could, in theory, be a parish council if they were set up to do it, had the skills and expertise to do it, and the developer appointed them. And I'm sure there are examples of where that's happened across the country. That's not something that we would stand in the way of happening. They would have to have the right expertise, etc. I don't know if you want to add to that, Leanne.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's the developer's decision as to who they appoint, and they undertake a market exercise, a tender exercise to get their nominated supplier. Anecdotally, I know that Bingham Town Council have been considering what they do with the new housing growth there, and they've considered stepping in as that role. Not sure where their thinking has got to, but I know that's something that they were considering. But as has been indicated, it's a very complex ask. And one of the things that we've recognised is that management companies, they've got that economy of scale across their sites, and they've got that expertise across many sites across the country, and that really does help to make it viable. And small organisations picking off one site, it's likely to make it more expensive, but then also you need to pull in lots of expertise. So you'd be subcontracting a lot of it out to other companies. And I think, yeah, just agreeing with Cara's response, our role is that facilitation role, as you mentioned. We don't have any powers, we don't have any control, we don't have a role, but what we've recognised is that by being passive and allowing the market to completely dominate, we recognise now there are some gaps that we think we could fill by our facilitation role. She's sort of detailed a bit more in.
Could you mandate like social value? Could you mandate like social value in procurement, for example, through the planning process, if they've got to like buy a management company, who that is?
Okay, Councillor Chewings. Sorry.
Yeah, so in response to your could it be off-site, planning policy does allow for contributions to be off-site, but the normal expectation is, I think, is on schemes of 50 or more, we have on-site provision. But even then, that's not an absolute firm cut-off. It is a matter of negotiation. So without necessarily knowing all the examples, there will be instances where it might be a scheme for 100, but it could be determined that off-site provision is a more acceptable approach. But it comes down to the particular location, particular scheme. But in theory, yeah, no reason why not.
Yeah, we're going to come to that. Yeah, Councillor Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I want to try and move the matter on, but this is an issue that's come up quite significantly in Councillor Way, went into some detail earlier on, and cast our mind back a fair few months, we had quite a lively debate in this very room at full council on the issue. It is a problem, and it's something that personally, looking at where we're at, and I understand the financial constraints and where we were at with those financial constraints, and we're talking about Fareham with £11 million, the forecasted cost, where 1% increase would only raise 77,000. What we're not counting into is the actual increase in precept that we're getting from those additional houses, because it's not a case of people are moving out of houses within Rushcliffe. It is an increase in housing base, and there is an increase from that. Now, what questions I do have is, up until 2011, this borough council took them in-house, and it's been the mention of perception of fairness. I'll go on record, it is unfair. It is unfair. Where I live, I pay my council tax, precept alone. If I fly tipping, contact the borough, get sorted out. If I was to move down the road into Hollygate Lane, you'd have to go through and have to pay a further tax. It is a further tax with a profit margin on top from a housing management company. And that's where that unfairness comes in. So the question is, what happened in 2011 to change our way? So moving away from us levelling, as under 5.3 of the document, as stated before, above historically the council adopted a public open spaces with commuted sum agreed and paid by the developer. What changed, and why do we move away from that process in 2011, where we agreed a 15-year fee for the management of open space? And I appreciate it didn't include SUDs from that document. What changed for us to move away from that? And more importantly, can we go back to that with the calculations for SUDs, and then we can start factor in? And then the other question is, we've looked at, and this within the document, there's mention of the risks to ourselves, etc., and the buying power. Have we looked at other local authorities? And I appreciate we brought in the management agency here today. What of other authorities? Is there any good practices from other local authorities that have reversed this? And that's the question. Those questions are to the officers, to be clear. And I think it's quite important, because I personally, where I'm at the moment, don't feel comfortable with recommendations, President. And I thank the officers for the work. There's been a tremendous amount of work put into this. It just doesn't go far enough for me, I'm afraid.
Right, I think your first question was around the change, and could we go back to that? And that was the commuted sum system, whereby the developer would provide the council with a 15 years a fee to cover maintenance of the land for 15 years. The part of the switch was led by developers and looking at their cash flow. And if you take Fareham as an example, a developer having to lay out £11 million upfront for a commuted sum, which would last 15 years, or a developer not having to lay out £11 million and spreading that cost over an annual amount per dwelling, and bearing in mind it's the developer's decision, it's their choice, that's a significant factor in considering how these spaces can be managed going forward. So even if the council decided that it would reverse that decision and go back to a commuted sum sort of scenario, the developer's got to agree. And in order for the developers to agree, that means that they're laying out that cash in advance. And what we were finding was that developers were not wanting to hand over that cash to maintain that land for 15 years in advance, because that impacted their bottom line, that impacted the cash flow, the viability of schemes. And so that was an important part in the transition. So it wasn't just the council sort of making a decision that it wasn't going to take on the land anymore, but also the council had an important consideration. After that money ends in 15 years, it's then got to find the equivalent of that to maintain it going forward. So there's two big factors, really. One, completely out of our control, is how developers deal with their cash flow and how they've decided to fund these sites. So even if we reversed the decision, we couldn't make developers pay as a community sum instead of the scenario that they're carrying out at the moment.
And that one point.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, that we can't put any conditions into the planning that has to take place. Then that's what was yourself, Richard.
Well, one, we don't do that at the moment. In terms of insisting that we adopt, we don't. That's not a planning policy at the moment, and I'm not sure we could do that, because I think there needs to be the flexibility to the market to effectively do what approach they want to do. But I mean, clearly we can look at that further. But at the moment, there is no planning policy that sets out that we would adopt. Well, clearly there isn't, because we're not doing that. So it would have to be something that we would look at as part of any new planning policy. But I think it would be difficult. And, you know, as we've set out, the report sets out, I think the normal practice is not to adopt nationally.
So I just want to come back on that, sorry, Chair. So we've not scoped that out. I think that's the clear message. I hear what you're saying, Richard, that it could be difficult, may not be normality, but it was normality prior to 2011. And surely we should be looking at doing things differently. And it's certainly scoping out to do things differently. And I'm sat here today, we've got quite an audience, and quite often these meetings there's lack of people. I should imagine it's to do with the subject matter, because there's quite a vested interest, because I've certainly heard from many residents, and I think we need to be looking into this. It may be a case that we scope it down with the legal advice is that we can't do this. But if we're sat here today for paper, and we have not explored this area, I find it difficult to make a decision today of a recommendation, personally. I think it needs to be pushed back for further investigation. And we need to do this properly. It affects so many people in our borough. It's such an important issue for so many people. And it's the only right thing to
do. We can investigate that a bit further. We have looked into this area, and I have had conversations with developers. And the point I just made, from those conversations, that's their position. The economics don't work for the developers to revert back to that system. And our own experience was that during that sort of transition, the developers wanting to pay over community sums wasn't happening. In fact, we've still got a couple of Section 106 agreements whereby the council, very old Section 106 agreements for housing estates, that the council will take on the land, and they just haven't come forward because we require a community sum from developers. And we're talking a few £100,000, nowhere near in the millions. And developers are still reluctant. They'd rather hang on to it than pass it back to the council, even though they could. So we've got a couple of those. We've got one in Saxondale at the moment, which is very historic, and they just haven't passed it. And we can't make them pass the land over to the council. So we have looked into that area. I don't know whether, well, I haven't looked to see whether policy legislation allows us to take that stance and force. I suspect not, because it's a market economy. However, we can look to see whether there's anything in legislation which can see whether we can enforce it. But our experience and the conversations I've had indicate that the developers are not in that space, that they're not given the choice. They're not prepared to give the community sum up front. And remember that there's no legislation for this, so the council has no power and authority to enforce it, which is why we've written to government in the past to say, you know, you need to regulate this market. And that's sort of the other thing that changed is what I referred to earlier about the shift in open space that came with development. So I don't know when the sort of the legislation changes happened, but housing estates in the past have nowhere near the amount of complex open space and infrastructure as they do now, and that's a gear shift for the council to take on that land as well. That sort of feeds into that conversation. Your other point was, yeah, we have looked at other councils to see how they do it, and overwhelmingly, it's the same picture nationally. So, haven't found any councils particularly that have reverted back to doing it in-house.
So there's an example that gets referenced, which is Stratford, but that is at the default is the towns and parishes take it on, which is what you referenced, and then where that isn't, where that's not forthcoming, then they are willing to explore taking it on. So that it's not definitive. I think that's a kind of a policy that's in development, but that's the only example that we found.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come to Councillor Matthews, and then I would like us to focus our attention on the actions proposed at Appendix B. So, in the hope that we can, consider those and spend some time thinking about what we are going to do rather than what we're not going to do.
Thank you, Chair. Just to thank Green Space for presenting. They do seem like a reputable management company, and I have no knowledge of your company, but you're only one, as I understand it, one of a number. A number of questions I have for the officers, I suppose. Do we know how many different management companies we've got that run in different parts of developments that we have? Because it seems that the area is, not only is it complex, as it says in the report, but it's becoming ever more complex with every development that happens. And I really do, it resonated with me what a number of the other councillors have been saying about the unfairness that this sort of invokes in people. And we've sort of, as a borough, I suppose, semi-responsible for creating some of this unfairness through our planning legislate, or through the planning process. If we're saying to developers they have to put in these open spaces, but we're not maintaining them, and they're simply passing the buck straight through lots of probably legalese gobbledygook to their buyers, it does seem incredibly unfair, and it's something that those residents are going to have to cope with for the entire life, if not blighted their house to sell on. So what these recommendations don't contain for me is any sort of thinking outside the box. And I suppose another question I have would be, can we change, or a fairer solution would seem to be that we just simply change the banding of the council tax on these particular houses? Is that something that we could do? So for these new developments such as Fareham, because it's going to come with a much bigger cost, that in order for us to adopt it, we could actually increase the council tax bandings so that we then take on a lot of the problems and are able to resolve those problems in-house, as the report suggested, that by the council adopting and taking on some of these responsibilities, it would sort out a lot of the problems for the residents. With a fairer system, they may still be paying the same charges in effect, but they're paying it through the council tax. Is that something that's been explored? Is that something that's even possible? Because obviously the council tax bandings cover not just us as Rushcliffe, but also the county council and fire and police authorities and all the different bits and pieces that go into making that up. So has that been explored? Is that even a possibility? Because to me, that would seem like a very much fairer way of doing it and solving some of the underlying issues that the report comes out with. Thank you.
Well, Pastor Leanne, I mean, I think one of the answers to your questions in terms of wouldn't it be better if the amounts were paid from council tax rather than as an additional charge, would be that the council can't deliver the same services for the cost that the management companies can for that charge. So you'd end up paying 2, 3, X X% more than would do. So there's a cost benefit assessment there. But I'll hand over to Leanne.
Thank you. Yeah, on the council tax point, I think given the total bill, most of it goes elsewhere. So the Rushcliffe Borough Council only retains, I can't remember the percentage, 5-ish, 6, 7% of the council tax bill. It's quite a small number of a bigger number, and so to generate the amount of extra revenue that would be required, it would be a significant hike on that bill. So I don't think that's a route that would change the position across the board, because it would exceed the amount that we could increase the council tax by, I think.
So I was referring to the banding of the houses as opposed to raising council tax generally. So for example, Fareham, if the houses that we've been put on there were all in band A, for example, could they be put into band B because of the additional costs? So that would have the effect of raising the council tax without us actually raising the council tax. If you know, does that make sense?
That does make sense. Although we're not in control of allocating banding, so that's the valuation office. Yeah, so that's not within our control to change the banding. That's the valuation office. Yeah. Your other question, I think, was about how many management companies there are. We don't have a total number. We know we've been speaking to 4, maybe. We know there are more than 4. There are 4 that sort of keep cropping up. We haven't yet got. We are compiling that list at the moment, but we haven't got a definitive answer to that at the moment. Was there another question in there?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, turning to the actions that are suggested in the report, which are in Appendix B of the report. The first one is around development of an SPD. Which do you want to sort of flesh out what the kind of detail, what kind of detail that might include, and what, if any, kind of additional teeth that document would give the council to address the concerns that we've heard about?
Yeah, well, the SPD we're preparing is covering the whole raft of developer contribution type issues like health, transport, etc. So with respect to open space, it is only one aspect of it. I have to be honest, I don't think it will necessarily give us much more teeth than we've sort of been discussing this evening. So with respect to open space management, I think it'll be sort of referencing best practice, but sort of highlighting we are looking to do further separate best practice as a sort of separate exercise. So it'll be more encouraging, but it won't be, unfortunately, we can't dictate a precise, we would like this to happen for the reasons we've sort of outlined in the report and we discussed this evening. So I think, you know, it certainly isn't a magic bullet in terms of resolving the issues that we've identified, but we will try and, you know, set out in more clear terms in that document what we would hope would happen rather than insisting will happen, because I don't think potentially we can do that based, again, on what we discussed this evening.
Thank you. There was a proposal to do a special planning document at Cabinet in March 21. And I suspect this hasn't happened, and it's nearly 3 years ago. And also in there it says that you were going to be looking at the wording and definitions in the SO106 agreements. And has any progress been made on that as well? Or is that going to be part of your new SPD?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, clearly, I mean, it is a while since Cabinet took that decision and we don't have that SPD. I mean, we have a number of SPDs on the go at the moment, and obviously we're doing another planning policy document, we did the development order, so all of it has to sort of take a sequence as to what is the priority. Plus, more recently, clearly we were waiting to see what the outcome of this work was, you know, its outcome to then feed into that SPD. So yes, it's not been done perhaps as quickly as we would have originally hoped. With respect to section 106 wording, unfortunately, I can't provide an answer to that. I'm not involved with that directly.
Is it going to be possible then to take on into consideration some of the quite good suggestions we've had tonight about encouraging people to act together with things? I'm thinking particularly of play facilities. We've got 2 adjoining estates in my ward, and each of them are going to have play facilities. And between them, they could probably provide a much better play facility. Unfortunately, they're both under different management strategies. But we've also had an example, which you probably know about, of one where the estate didn't want play facilities on their land. Now, we were able, with your help and other people at the council, to use that money to put a nearby play facility together with other funding. And maybe we should be looking at things like this in more general terms to take away the idea that this belongs to this estate. I have examples of children being told to leave play facilities because they don't live there and they're not paying for it. And this is leading to fractured communities. And this is something I feel very strongly about. We do not want fractured communities and people on opposite estates being set up against each other. So a way of looking at in these documents or the other ones that we're going to look at to get cooperation and more holistic ways of looking at things, I think will help enormously with the perception of these estates and open spaces.
I mean, I could. I mean, from the perspective of the SPD, we have to be mindful it is supplementary planning guidance, so it can only be. It has to sit based on what we already have in the plan, the local plan. It can only go so far in terms of it can only deal with those issues that fall within the remit of the planning system, and also it is there for determining plan applications. So some of the aspects that you've referred to, yes, we can look at what we might be able to encapsulate within the document, but there are some of these aspects that go beyond the direct planning system and are more about the management of these facilities into the long term, and also more corporate decisions. So those aspects may not necessarily be best dealt with through the SPD directly, but that's not to say they shouldn't be dealt with in some other forum. In terms of the second item on there, in terms of good practice guide, it may be that certain aspects were better covered in that than they would be in the SPD. But I think that is for us to look at, and obviously then members to take a decision on that in due course.
Thank you.
Councillor Grocott.
Thanks. I mean, I absolutely support what Councillor Turing was saying about a more root and branch look into other models, and I agree with him that in an ideal world, I'd love to return to that pre-2011 model. In terms of this, though, I think we can be a little bit more specific in terms of what some of those, whether it's in the SPD or the Code of Conduct, is. I work a lot in public procurement, and of course, there are strong guidelines in place, which is rightly the case it should be. But there are criteria around social value. There are resources the council can put in place around market development. Market development of strong socially minded partners, which they can make introductions to developers on behalf of. We can use more robust language in this space. We can have Chinese walls between the developers' procurement systems and the market development work that the council does in the background to encourage parish councils, town councils, and socially minded management companies to get access to these developers. There's a huge amount of work we can do there, which doesn't preclude the right of the housing of the developer to procure whoever they want to preclude. And we can also, you planning officers know this as well. We can use all kinds of encouragement through the planning process to make these introductions. I wrote a 106 policy for Nottingham City Council around employment and training planning contributions. It had no basis in planning policy, but guess what? Every single developer signed up to it. Why? Because it wasn't that hard to do. And they played those contributions, and we delivered employment and training requirements for the people of Nottingham City. There's things that we can do in this space that make it far more robust. And I think the language needs to be more specific and needs to encourage this almost list of activities that the council says it's going to do to facilitate this type of relationship and this type of consistency, notwithstanding my desire to ultimately go back to a fairer system in the first place. Thank you.
And does anybody want to come in on that?
I agree. I think just because we can't force somebody to do it doesn't mean we shouldn't do something. So that's the purpose of the code that we're suggesting. Although we can't make developers sign up to it, we think that if we have got that, exactly as you say, using robust language, being very clear about what our expectations are, setting those in a very easy to understand way, setting up those expectations, making those connections, and this is all about what we're putting down in our recommendations, making those connections, facilitating that blank space as it exists currently. And although we can't force developers to sign up to it, although we can't refuse a planning application on the grounds of them not having signed up to it, they've got to say why they can't or why they won't. So it puts the developer in a position where they've got to respond to what we're asking them. So even though we can't enforce it, you know, we'd improve those. We are improving our relationships with all of our applicants, including developers, to get them into that space where it's more collaborative, and we're meeting that middle ground. So it's not at the moment, or where it has been, allowing the developers to sort of fill the space in its entirety. So yeah, I agree.
Just perhaps one another point from me in relation to the planning policy bit before we sort of, I think we're naturally segueing into the code of practice bit, but the forgive me, I've just lost the paragraph number, but we talk about kind of 411, 412, the use of conditions and the tests for that. You know, looking at the last point, the last last couple of sentences of paragraph 4.12, saying that the MPPF says conditions need to satisfy 6 tests: necessary, relevant to planning, relevant to the development being permitted, enforceable, precise, reasonable in all aspects. You know, perhaps this is an element where we could, you know, add to our actions, getting some advice externally if needs be about being particularly, you know, we want to be robust in this area. These are some of the things that we might be considering. Yeah, give us some advice on whether you know how far we think we can push it. It's just, I don't think you need to come back. Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with your sentiment there, and that's the point I was going to come on, is that we have a proposal here today, and a lot of work's been put into this. But for me, from the scrutiny of today's meeting, there's areas of this group that we want to expand on further advice, part of that being the legal advice. We've also heard today from a management company, but then we've also, through further scrutiny, we've understand that Stratford Council have got an alternative way of working forward. So wouldn't it be nice to hear from them and how they go about it, a guest speaker, and further information on that, so we can make informed decisions, and that could impact on a code of practice, a way forward. And for me, there's further information. So just want to put those points across it. I will be proposing an amendment shortly, but just want to put those points forward to yourselves.
I'll do my utmost not to forget. I'm sure you'll draw my attention if we don't get there, Councillor Jones. I'm little doubt in that. So turning then to the good practice guide development, you know, would I be right? And it was sort of, how do I put this? You know, reference is made to this NHQC. If I've understood it correctly, that's the developers that sign up to that, not the agents. You know, some of the issues that we've heard a lot about are you know, difficulties with mechanisms for dealing with resident issues or escalation of concerns and not feeling like they're not getting anywhere. So if I've understood that correctly, there is a clear need here for something separate to and additional to NHQC, because that's the developers and it's the no disrespect to the residents here, but that's where we think we might need there to be a system for redress and other issues.
I think yes, developers do sign up to that. What we're seeing though is that government legislation is trying to catch up with this. So the Leaseholders Reform Bill is going to put freehold homeowners on a level playing field with leaseholders, thereby allowing a form of redress. An ombudsman, so another organisation that can resolve any disputes. The council hasn't got a role in filling that space. We can't step in to where that gap is between the NHQC. The council can't step into that space. We don't have those powers to do that, but we're expecting the legislation to plug that gap with the Leaseholder Reform Bill.
I've got a feeling Councillor Groscott's going to say something that everyone else is thinking.
But couldn't we have, again, if we've got a code of conduct for developers potentially, could we not have something that we also almost like a register? And again, I'm asking that these guys, do these things exist in other places? A register of management companies, which has its own code of conduct to it as well, and it's a voluntary register. Of course, it's not something that the council actually has any legal obligation to oblige any management company to sign up to, but something that again creates an accountability and a visibility. No business wants to be seen as unscrupulous and cutthroat, they want to. So if we put in place these kinds of requirements, notwithstanding the fact that you're saying legislation will hopefully fill that gap, it's something else we could do in this space to create a visibility and encourage as far as possible with our soft power, good practice.
That is something we can put in the code, that they've got a complaints procedure. Most companies do have a complaints procedure outside of any legislation anyway, so we would expect to see that. So as part of the code, that would be one of the criteria. As I say, or as Cara said earlier, these recommendations aren't the end of the story. It's been an ongoing project. We're discovering this as we're going along. So we're committing to putting together this code of good practice, but we need to explore what goes in it yet. So yes, I agree with what you're saying, that we need to use robust language, we need to be very clear, we need to be setting the bar high as to what our expectations are, and things that really companies shouldn't have a problem signing up to. But we haven't. That's the next bit that we're developing. And when we produce planning policy or guidance, it normally goes through the LDF group, which would be my proposal, that we prepare that code and then it goes through the local development group to scrutinise that as part of the planning policy, as would the SPD. So that would be the next step.
Just to add to that as well, there's a stewardship framework being developed by Burning with Nature, which will be voluntary, but it's envisaged that good quality open space and green infrastructure management companies will be part of that stewardship framework. And similarly with TCPA as well, those sort of good practice guides are voluntary, but from a management company point of view, we want to demonstrate that we are not just there to collect the money. We'll be signing up to those, and the Burning with Nature stewardship framework we're heavily inputting in the framework development, so they should assist as well.
I can just add to that. We gave evidence at the Welsh Senate about 3 weeks ago, and it wasn't maybe as in depth as this, but they asked they asked the same question about where else has the arrangements for management companies been pulled in and regulated, and we said that up in Scotland back in 2006 there was a problem. that existed. There was a lot of property managers or factors managing the existing housing stock, but a lot of new housing stock as well, and new housing sites and developments, estates. And what they were receiving inundated with complaints and queries. So what they introduced was the new Property Factors Act Scotland, which regulated the industry. So any factor or any property management company has to get registered and then abide by standards that to ensure that the property is properly maintained and there's all complete transparency to residents and end users. And that's actually what led to us having to, by law, to create a written statement of service for each property that is managed that Greenbelt manage in Scotland. And we've now rolled that out, because the process is actually very good, we've rolled that out to all parts of the UK, because it is good practice, but it's not regulated at the moment in England and Wales.
Thank you. We've got a couple, three more actions to look at. Starting to be particularly conscious of time. The third one about growth boards, I suspect would not be contentious. Shout up now if it would be. So the next one is about some kind of advocacy role in the council falling short of falling short of a particularly active role. What would the process from here look like in developing this as an idea?
I think what we've heard is from pockets of residents on particular developments so far that have got that are not satisfied with the service that they're getting. So our initial focus would be on getting that in those instructions in those areas on track first, whereby we understand who the management companies are. The residents are represented by residents groups and the management company, and getting an introduction of those, having initial meetings. We've spoken to Greenbelt colleagues, and they've said that they hold regular resident meetings. We don't think that's happening across all management companies, and so that's the bit that we will be targeting under that action, to understand why those residents meetings aren't happening, and to try to get that introduction between residents and those management companies where they're falling short.
Yeah, Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chair. I think a lot of the residents that I represent would disagree with that statement about having regular meetings, because they're saying that they're finding communications with the management company very difficult and almost impossible at times. So I'd sort of like to encompass the last three action plans. First of all, looking at the code of practice, I think we've discussed, Leanne, that this has been a real learning experience in terms of what issues are arising as time moves on, because these issues aren't immediately obvious. Quite a few of the issues that I've been asked to deal with revolve around circumstances that arise further down the line, because they weren't obvious in the first place, or people didn't understand the complexities of it. With the growth board, I know a lot of our growth boards have been disbanded, including the one in my ward, but I think this is where we reenact one of those growth boards or something similar, so that the existing resident groups, and again from my ward we've got some really knowledgeable representatives from the various estates who've done a huge amount of background work and know a lot about what they're talking about. And I'd like to see them able to be part of these groups so that we get a full dialogue from all directions. So I think what I'm saying is we need to get some interaction between the management companies and the residents directly. I appreciate the work that Cara and Leanne have done, and the fact that they can become sort of a middle ground in there and bring it together. But I do think it's important that we have some resident representatives on those committees or boards or whatever, so they have a chance to talk directly to people.
I need to go back and have a look at the terms of reference for the growth boards. But yeah, we can have a look to see whether it's appropriate to have the residents represented on those. The growth boards are to cover a broad range of matters, and what I wouldn't want to happen is that it suddenly becomes focused on specific existing issues. So I think it might be better as that forum sits outside of the growth boards, so that we can have a proper detailed discussion between developers, management companies and residents without the constraints of the broader remit of the growth boards. So I think we'd achieve more. I think everybody would achieve more if that was a separate meeting, not forming part of those growth boards. And that action there that we're discussing is putting some of those meetings in place, trying to get those meetings in place. So it requires, I think, we've got willing residents, but it also requires willing management companies and willing developers, and that's the bit we would work on to make sure that we could get them all in a room together.
Thank you. I think that's what the residents are looking for.
And I think, look, the key aspect from my perspective in relation to this sort of advocacy recommendation is, how is the concept of what the council is going to do and what the council isn't going to do going to be developed? Because it's a little bit, I totally understand the view that it isn't for the council to fully fight every battle, but so where does how are we going to be clear on what we are going to do and what we're not going to do?
I think the next step for us is to work out some terms of reference. So when we've set up the growth boards, we set out some clear terms of reference about what its objectives are and what they aren't. And we'd need to do the same thing for this. And I think the council's role will go as far as setting up those initial introductions. What the council won't be doing is acting as arbiter in between those two parties on an ongoing basis. So it's an initial kicking off, introduction, getting the parties speaking to each other, seeing whether we can get management companies to retrospectively sign up to the code and make sure that their actions are reputable in the same way that we would like to see new developers and management companies sign up to the code. So that would be where I see our role, trying to get them into a place where they are more accountable to that code. Because I think what we've learned as we've gone through this process is that some of these were set up a long time ago, and they've evolved over time, and the companies themselves are evolving with the services. And I'm aware of one developer who removed the charge. What's in East Leak, isn't it? Removed the land charge from properties because it recognised itself that it wasn't fair and reasonable to have a charge on people's houses. So developers are also moving into that space where they're saying, well, what's the impact on residents? And I think we just need to give a nudge to some of those that are a bit slower coming into that space. So the short answer is we've got to put those terms of reference down, but it's not going to be, the council isn't going to step into that space where they're dealing with every individual complaint that comes forward. It just can't facilitate that, but it can facilitate initial introductions and getting those developers and mancos to sign up.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Chewings.
Thank you, Chair. It's not that bad. Okay, so obviously we have the recommendations A through to E. What I would like to propose, and seeking a seconder, is retain Part A, Part C, Part D, and Part E. We strike out Part B, which accepts the conclusions arrived in Section 5. And just an explanation of why I'm proposing that is I think there's further scope work that needs to be carried out, because Section 5 says the cost is too great and there's no other alternatives at this moment in time. I think that from the scrutiny today, I think there are areas that we can scope out before we can come to that final decision, but we should certainly be working through the other areas to look at what action can be taken. And then there's 3 additions I'd like to propose.
So I'll just check my understanding here. So is one of the recommendations no. Okay, so you're proposing remove B.
Remove B.
Yeah.
And purely, yeah. So remove B. Well, they'll be renumbered, won't they? So C would become B, D would become, and so forth. But I'll actually tie that up later.
Okay.
So remove B.
I'm calling your first new one F.
That's fine. I won't object to that. So 3 additions, and that would be F. Investigate the legal position on whether a commuted sum to cover maintenance 15 years can be legally enforced for RBC to take it on board. G, I think we're on.
Yeah.
Investigate the work carried out by Stratford Council. I invite a guest speaker to the Growth and Development Scrutiny group so we can scrutinise their actions and look at alternatives. And then D, H, yeah, it's my upper D, you see. H. And this is around the costings. So as I alluded to earlier, we're talking about the 1% increase to get the 77,000, but we're not taking into account the increase in revenue. So the part H, detailed forecast of revenue for an example development for RBC for the 15-year period. And I probably suggest that we do that with Fair and Pastures, since we've accounted the cost of £11 million. So we look into what additional revenue will come through the precept for the RBC section. And then we can make an informed decision. Time to repeat that, or?
No, I haven't got it word for word, but I think I've got
the gist.
I think I've got the general gist, which is investigate legal position on commuted sum recovery.
Yep.
The second one being investigate Stratford.
Yeah, and invite a guest speaker.
Yeah, maybe we should go there rather than make them here. But
a
day trip. And the last one, more detailed forecasts on revenues from increased tax base.
Yeah, and for example developments, I would suggest that be fair, because we've got the cost base of £11 million for that 15-year period. So then we've got a comparison point.
Do you want to remember before? See if he's got a second there.
Yeah.
Okay. Just regarding the H, the additional revenue that's generated from housing growth is already accounted for in delivering existing services. So bin collections, the other services the council delivers, that council tax that we'll be collecting is to deliver the services that we already deliver to those houses. So I appreciate your point, but there won't be any additional sort of surplus, because it would be a new funding stream that would be required to do the maintenance of the land. So that the council tax is spent on services that would already be needed to be for services.
I appreciate that point, but if you think like the council tax that we pay already, a certain percentage from my council tax will be for the bin collection, which will be additional for Fair and Pastures, but also a certain percentage will be also to cover the facilities of graffiti removal, which we're not providing for these individuals, the maintenance of land. And so I think we need to put a breakdown, but is there any surplus? And just to have that breakdown, it should be quite easy to crunch those numbers. It's just so we can get that full forecast and we can come to an informed decision.
My understanding is that the council tax raised doesn't cover statutory services already, which is why we have other income streams in the authority. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, so I think we've understood that, and it seems like the best sensible question for me now is: does Councillor Chewings have a seconder? Okay.
I'll second it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think as well, I think the point that you're making is fine, but at the moment we're presented with a gap between 77k and 11 million. I'd like to see what the gap is when we're considering all the other factors that Councillor Chewins has mentioned. Thanks.
So could I just say, fine, could I say regarding the Stratford, that might be better managed as officer gathering information. We can say something. Officers gathering information and reporting it back to the group, rather than expecting somebody from Stratford to come and talk to us about what they do at the moment. But
sorry, I do disagree with that. I can't expect them to attend. We can certainly extend an invite. We've brought a management company here to speak. It's only reasonable we ask for an alternative perspective. So my amendment stands. Thank you.
Well, only to say that I have reached out to them previously and not had a response. I've reached out a couple of times, not to say that we can't continue to. And there's stuff in the public domain that if you know they've got cabinet papers about when they took that decision. There isn't a great deal of information in there, so obviously I have looked into it. They've not put the financial case out there into the public domain about how they made that decision. We can obviously continue to try and get in touch with them.
Anybody else got anything to say about the proposed amendment? Otherwise, we'll go to the vote. So all those in favour of Councillor Chewings' amendment?
Sorry.
Yeah. So, yeah, happy. Understand what we're doing. So, at the moment, the recommendation from Councillor Chewings is to, I think we're going to have to get in two stages here. The first being that the recommendations are amended to remove B and add the 3, and I think we vote on that and then vote on the recommendations if that's passed. But let's just deal with one thing at first, which is that the people who are in favour of Councillor Chewing's amendments to the recommendations. Do you want to see how you go first? Because you can always make a set. You can always make a.
Let's do one at a time then. How about that?
They haven't got. Sorry, to investigate the legal position on recovery of commuted sums.
enforcing developers to
Are you happy to second all of all of them on an individual basis as you work collectively?
I am.
Assume, but let's just check.
Yes.
Okay, so first, those in favour of removing recommendation B. That's 5-4, and those against? Four. Okay, so on that, the next one is those in favour of adding the first additional recommendation that we've called F, investigating legal position on commuted sum recovery. Those in favour? Okay, thank you. Next one is investigating the position approach taken by Stratford Council. Those in favour? And the last one is detailed forecasts on revenues, taking Fareham as a case study, if you like. Those in favour? Okay, so that amendment is carried as well. So we have, well, there we are. You never know how it's going to go. I think for completeness, we now ought to have a vote on the recommendations, because somebody might be desperate or upset about A, C, or D. So with the amended can I ask those in favour of the amended recommendations as they now stand? Okay, happy? Very good, thank you. So we battered that round for a good couple of hours. Thank you in particular to Adam and Robin for their attendance today. We shan't be offended if you want to slip off at this stage to catch the end of the darts. So, Callum, I hope it was worth waiting for. Is that enjoyable discussion? Yeah, very good. Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I mean, everyone always says that, keep it to 3 minutes, but we can do that by, we are going to start at 8:30, whether you're here or not. Right, it's 8:30 and we said we were going to, we said we were going to start. So we move on to item number 5. And just before we start, Catherine's just going to give us a bit of an update and some background.
Just very briefly, so this is a follow-up from an item that came, and this is contains the report, it's a follow-up from an item that came to Growth and Development Scrutiny in September 2022, and I'm aware that some members around the table were at that meeting, where we had an update from Severn Trent Water and the Environment Agency. And members at that meeting expressed an interest in having Notts County Council, the local flood authority, come to explain their role in a similar way that the Environment Agency and Severn Trent Water had at that meeting. What we and obviously Callum is here this evening to give us that update. What we had also hoped was that we could have Severn Trent Water and the Environment Agency back this evening to give us an update following the previous discussions and some of the actions that came out of that. So we had got 2 officers that were due to attend from the Environment Agency, but both have sent apologies today because they've both been called to flood response, as you might expect. But I'm more than happy to come to a future meeting to talk to us, so we can add that onto our work programme for them to come back at another time. Severn Trent Water came back with an email response, and I can circulate the contents of that with the notes of the meeting with an update. So again, we can ask them to come to a future meeting, but based on the contents of the email, I'm not sure that they have capacity to attend meetings at individual districts, but we can ask the question again. But that was it from me. So Callum, if you want to take over, and I'll put my slides up.
Thank you. Thanks for having me as well. So I believe back then the ask was regarding sewer discharges, and I will say that I'm afraid my presentation would be incredibly short if I had to focus just on that, because unfortunately our role as the lead local flood authority doesn't actually encompass sewer discharges itself. So should Severn Trent want to have a consented sewer overflow into a watercourse, we wouldn't necessarily get involved in that. That would be for our colleagues over environmental health or the Environment Agency, so they'd be the ones managing that. So speaking to Catherine, we thought it'd be beneficial to go a bit over our role and what we're currently doing. And at the end, I can go over more specifics if you've got any areas. For example, we're doing some work in Gotham. We're proposing some work in Butler that we can discuss as well. So I think that would be beneficial right at the end. If we could just move on to the next slide. It wouldn't be right without giving a little bit of a throwback to Storm Babette. Now, if I'd had time, I would have added Storm Henk into this one as well, but unfortunately, time did not allow that today. So back to Storm Babette, across the authority as a whole, we had around 1,200 properties internally affected. So that is water at least entering part of the fabric of the building. For this purposes, we talk about under the floor. In the top left image as well, we would count I don't think actually that is a garage on the side, but anything that affects the fabric of the building is what we would classify. So that's where we get our 1,200 properties from, spread across 79 areas across the county. It was a wide event that covered from the north, south, east and west. Normally we tend to see it in one specific area. So normally it would be Rushcliffe or everything that's affected, but this one was across the whole of the county, which is why resources got a little bit stretched over the period. Focus though on Rushcliffe itself. Rushcliffe are actually, I don't want to say well off, I never like that term, because 28 properties is still 28 more than we ever want to see affected. But in the grand scheme of things, when we had Basildor and Broxtowe with over 300, we were fairly well off here. I've listed some of the key areas which were affected, which we do see time and time again, and you're no strangers to this. I'm sure you're all aware of the issues your constituents have in their areas as well. But if you'd like to go over any more of those details later on, I'll be happy to. Move on, please. So our role. We have a role to, and I like to always describe it as an umbrella, which seems apt in the terminology. So the Environment Agency, via East Midlands on behalf of NCC, Severn Trent Water, districts and boroughs, parish councils, everyone has a role to play in managing flood risk. And we see our role as a bit of more coordination between all of them. So there is a specific to us. So we manage the risk from surface water. So plainly, the rain that falls out of the sky lands on the ground and floods someone from that is our responsibility to help manage. Should it enter into the main rivers, it's the responsibility of the Environment Agency to manage. And should it enter into the sewers and subsequently flood, it's the requirement of the local water and sewage company to manage it. But we work as that umbrella company, I'll say, to manage all these authorities, bring them together to be that sounding board for residents they come direct to us if they don't understand something. We can provide that help, support and guidance, and we can go to all those authorities and those different companies to discuss what needs to happen and how you can provide that support further to them. We are a statutory consultee on major planning applications, so any application where there's 10 or more properties or more than 1 hectare. One thing I will note is we are only guidance, unfortunately. So should an LPA decide that actually our comments are not valid, they have the ability to overrule us. Doesn't happen very often because obviously they rely on us for the expert advice that we provide. But it is something that we do have to tell people because there have been some instances in the past where perhaps a condition may have been tweaked because the wording doesn't meet their local requirements and it has caused issues in the long run. So we have to be certain about what we're saying to people to say that, okay, we're asking for X, Y, Z, but this is only guidance. So we do have to tread carefully when we're doing these discussions with residents and with the developers. We have a good relationship with most developers across the county. We offer a pre-application advice at no cost, so they come direct to us to discuss their requirements, our requirements, and how we can make that better for all the residents. We maintain a register of assets, which is completely online. Everyone can access it, which shows what we define as our critical assets across the county. So, for example, any bridges, any culverts, any trash screens, which we define as they're going to be critical to managing flood risk. We inspect those on an annual basis. We have land range officers who go out to make sure they're maintained, they're kept to the best of their ability. All public information, people can find that online, and I would advise at some point to go and see that. And if you're aware of anything that your residents bring up or that you're aware of in your areas that are of concern that don't feature on a register, please let us know and we can go out and investigate that. We can add it, we can edit and change it to make sure that we are given that proper view of risk across the county. Land drainage consents. So anyone who wants to work on any form of watercourse across the county, which isn't main river. So for example, your ditches in your fields, the stream that runs along your residents' back garden, they are not able to work on it without our consent. So there is a process in place that they come to us, they tell us what they want to do, and we give them the permission to do so. And that's a legislative requirement just to ensure that water is able to freely move. We don't want people damming and building bridges over watercourses, restricting them, causing problems upstream. So that's one of our roles, is just to manage that issue moving forward again. We publish and develop the local risk management strategy, which I'll go on in a bit later because we did do a bit of a review on that, and I would welcome anyone to have a look at that and to provide comments. And we really do work with our community. So we want to be able to provide that support. We want to be able to provide that guidance. But one of the key things we do is making sure that people know how to be more resilient as well. So working with the parish groups, working with the town councils, working with the districts and boroughs to make sure we can disseminate this information, because flooding is a very complicated matter and it doesn't always get easy when there's multiple agencies involved. So we always want to try and enforce that people know who to come to, people know what they need to say. And that's what we're really trying to get out there these days, is providing that advice, providing that support, and where possible, providing the schemes as well. So I'll touch on that probably just at the end briefly. If you don't mind moving on to the next one. So I touched on our local reviews and this is our preliminary flood risk assessment. So every 6 years we're required to do a simple amendment to these documents, but we had a look at ours. Hadn't been reviewed since it was first created in 2012, and we didn't feel that it was appropriate to just create another new amendment. So we completely rewrote the document based on all of the advice that we've been having from our residents, from our community groups, and from our local authorities as well. That's been out to consultation, and we've had a lot of comments back from it. It was published back in July, so a couple months back now. So I would always advise, if anyone's got any concerns in your areas about flood risk, if they have a look at this document, it will highlight some of those key areas and highlight who's responsible, how we can move to the next steps, where we move to the next steps, and provides a little bit more advice. We've made it very easy to read this time. The old document was, I think, in the room of about 100 pages. We've cut it down to about 12 to make it really simple, with some additional documents that you can read as supplementaries, but we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to all residents across the authority. Next slide, please. Briefly touch on, because I have talked about this, so we are a statutory consultee. Our comments are only deemed as advice. We only will comment on surface water elements, unfortunately. So for some sites where there may be sewer issues on site, or it may be adjacent to the main river, we unfortunately are not allowed to provide comments on that. So we can only provide specific bespoke comments on surface water elements. We'll still work with our partners, so we'll work with the local planning authority, and we'll also work with Severn Trent and the Environment Agency to make sure the comments are holistic and they're engaged with each other, because we don't want to be saying something that's going to be a detriment to the Environment Agency wanting some floodplain storage, for example. So we do work closely with them. Just as a remit, so we've commented on over 4,000 applications since 2015, so that's specifically for major applications. So we do comment on minor applications in areas where there's a flood risk. So for example, if a member was to come to us and say, I'll take Costock as an example, there's a new development in Costock, it's only 3 houses, but there is a lot of history here. We will still provide bespoke comments on that if there are concerns. So please be rest assured that we will still look at everything and won't just focus on the majors. Next slide, please. A quick one, just to say what we're currently doing. So we do have a suite of drones in the authority at the moment, which is managed by myself, and we have some qualified pilots throughout the authority, mostly in a flood risk team. We do use these as a method for surveying during flooding events. So we are looking at probably getting them out tomorrow to do some surveying based on Storm Henk, the effect it's having on the Trent, and to make sure our communities are safe. So we'll be going to the likes of Gunthorpe, for example, to make sure that anyone that is cut off, we can provide that information to the emergency planning group, to the police and fire rescue, so they know where to implement their resources. They can provide them to those at-risk communities at will. What I will say as well, we do work with partners or anything, so if you've got any requirement for them, please come direct to us. If you want us to go to a specific place to take, it doesn't even have to be flood related. So we've done work for highways, we'll do work for promotional stuff. So if you want us to come see you, just to help you, we're more than happy to be amicable to that, providing our resources there. Obviously at the moment we're a little bit stretched, so we might want to push that back a little bit. Next slide, please. Property flood resilience is something that we're trying to push at the moment. So traditional schemes can be fraught with a lot of complexities. They can be difficult to implement because of cost-benefit relationship requirements. We take all of our funding externally from DEFRA, so we bid into the pots that the Environment Agency hold. There are stringent guidelines that we have to use for this for obvious reasons, because it is taxpayers' money, so we have to ensure that we are getting value for money. But to do so makes schemes incredibly delayed. So for the likes of, I'll take Tollerton as an example, Tollerton cannot always attract the funding it needs to be able to protect some of the properties. So we've been able to, using our own capital finance, fund property flood resilience works. So that's the likes of flood resistant doors, air bricks, sealant. In Tollerton itself, it involved an entire wall around a suite of cottages, including flood resilient gates to ensure that those properties were protected. And traditionally, they work really well. And in Tollerton, they were effective in protecting some of these properties during flooding events. Unfortunately, the roads still affected. They are still cut off to some degree. But what we're trying to focus on is to make sure the integrity of that property is protected. We don't want the water getting in. So in the remit, while we're waiting for these schemes to come out of the woodwork, while we're putting those bids in for money, we're really trying to protect the properties at the base level to say, okay, we know this is important. Let's get some money into it. Let's get these properties protected, and then we can work on the schemes. So we can ensure those properties remain safe whilst we get in the bigger picture. It works well. We've got a good sign up of people that come through, and generally we see it working effectively. There are issues at hand. They can only protect up to 600 millimeters, for example. So in major storm events, unfortunately, they will fail, but that's because of structural requirements. So a building can't withstand a certain amount of water on it, so they do have to be designed to that. But they are beneficial, and residents are very happy when we do install them, and we do. So what I would ask as well is if you're aware of any areas where you see repeated flooding, where you've only got 1 or 2 properties or very small communities, please do let us know. There'll be an email at the end, and we can do those investigations. We can look into that to see, okay, is there anything we can do to protect those residents in the interim whilst we try and find these large schemes. Next slide, please. One thing we have rolled out recently, so we've taken on from our emergency planning colleagues, is what we refer to as a community flood signage scheme. So this allows trained members of the community to close roads during flood events. Traditionally, the only people who can close roads are traffic officers and the police, but these powers get disseminated down to members of the community. We have 18 active schemes at the moment. It allows us to ensure that residents remain safe through one of the major causes we see are bow waves from cars driving through floodwaters. They think they can get through, causes that bow wave which floods the adjacent properties. We obviously have very limited resources to get across the entirety of a county during a flooding event. So where communities are happy to do so, we will set up an event with them, via East Midlands as well. We will put in place set locations where they can close the roads. They have permission to do it themselves. They'll have specific thresholds. So, for example, we've got a new one down in Cropwell Butler. When the water gets to the bottom of the curb height on Main Street, they are allowed to go and shut that road and stop traffic going through. There are some issues with it because obviously some drivers will still decide to ignore it. But unfortunately, what we do see is the vast majority of them do listen to it. The community do see a benefit to it. So again, my ask here is if you're aware of any communities where you think they would benefit from this, please do get in contact with us. We're always looking to get new volunteers on. They can join our team through the community flood sign scheme as well, but they can also join the environment agencies. So they've got a flood warden scheme as well, and we link up together. So they'll get reports directly from the environment agency as well. They don't have to rely on checking it themselves. They'll get that information through direct to themselves as well. So there is a chance for them to meet up. So the ones along the Trent corridor or the Aerowash, anything will work. Yep. Sorry, next slide. I think I've got so this is our last major point. And I will say, unfortunately, we've slightly delayed it this year, obviously, with a response from Storm Henk and Storm Babette. We can't do it currently this month. But last year, we have this, developed an education session. So we've been going into schools across the region. We've done a few in Rushcliffe. We've done Tollerton Primary School. We've done Ashfield, Basildor, etc. So we go into schools. We've been targeting year 4 and year 5 at the moment. And we do a full day session with some hands-on experiments. So we've got in the bottom left picture, there's the augmented reality 3D sandbox. Very, very fancy name. In its base element, it is a sandbox which the kids can play in, but it projects a catchment onto it. They can make it rain with their hands and it virtually makes the catchment flood. They learn about how and where to build. Is it smart to build on the floodplain? How can you make new defences to protect these properties? The bottom right, we have our SUDS model. And we've talked about SUDS a little bit this earlier today in new developments. So we talk about the benefits of SUDS, how it slows the water down for third parties, how it increases biodiversity. We get them to interact with it, and then we do an experiment at the end where we flood both houses and we see what the effect is on the SUDS house and what the effect is on the normal urban house. And we see the drastic difference that there's barely any water coming from the SUDS house, whereas the urban house is completely flooded. And then at the top, we use some aqua sacks, so they're self-inflating sandbags in essence. We get the kids to self-inflate them. So they build a wall around their teacher's foot. We then throw the bucket of water down to the teacher and try and keep her safe. We haven't failed yet. We have not got a teacher wet, which we're very proud of, and the kids are very proud of as well. The point of this session is really to get kids excited and interested and thinking about climate change, flooding, and what they can do at this age moving forward to then help this moving forward. So they can look at those properties that have such features. They can make those informed decisions. They can be the next engineers of tomorrow, which are really focusing on flood risk. They can be the new planning officers, which really want to hammer this point home. So we're trying to get in at an early stage. We've not just done year 4 and 5, though. We've done Girl Guides, we've done Bilborough College, and we've also done Nottingham Trent University. So we've tailored it to different levels, depending on what we're doing. And again, what I would ask here is if you're aware of any schools which you think would benefit from this, please let us know. We can arrange it direct with the schools. I will say, obviously, in the next month or 2, we are working on the communities at the moment, so they will probably have to take a bit of a back burner. But by all means, I think it's been we've had massively positive feedback from them. So if you are aware of any communities and any schools that benefit from this, please do get in contact with us and let us know, and we can hopefully go and see them and get this working for them. And I think that's my last slide. Any specific questions on what I've said today, or any information you have on communities, flood signage schemes, any schools you think would be interested, if you can send it to that email address, and that will get disseminated to me or the relevant officer. For example, Josh leads our community signage scheme, so he'll be the one who manages that moving forward. Yeah, that in a nutshell is what we do. We do a lot more, obviously, but I can only get so much in 10 minutes, and I don't want to take too much of your time up. But I will just briefly touch on some of the good work that we are doing in some of the areas in Rushcliffe. So we have got a bid in at the moment for Courtwell Butler, where we're looking at implementing natural flood management techniques. So we've taken on new skills in-house where we can now look at these techniques. So traditionally, flood management has been very hard civil engineered, pipes in the ground, giant storage crates to hold water. What we're trying to do is move to a more natural way of managing water. So we're looking at leaky barriers in watercourses. We're looking at creating depressions in the land. We're looking at trying to slow the water down rather than just store it somewhere. So we keep the natural element, we increase biodiversity, we increase open spaces, we try and green our county again. And that's what we're working forward in Courtwell Butler. And we've also been successful in some money for Gotham as well. So moving forward, I'll be working with landowners to implement some further natural flood management over there. We have already done a lot of work there, and this is the final suite of it, just to ensure that those properties do remain protected. We have obviously seen a great benefit there. There are still some risks that we're trying to manage, but that's hopefully what this future money is going to be used for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and ending on the best news of all there with the news about Gotham, of course. But Councillor Grocock.
I want a piece of that, absolutely. Thanks, really useful presentation. Just on the last point, have you linked in with the D2N2 Careers Hub at all regarding the work in schools that you're doing? Because they specialise really in linking businesses, or rather employers, to schools. And I know that Phil's wife actually works for them. I know that they would really value having someone like you as an enterprise advisor, as they call them, going along and talking about the different careers you can have in flood management along with that. So you could do that. That's more of a secondary school thing. There's also a primary project as well that's going on. So if you haven't got links to the D2N2 Careers Hub, I'm sure one of us could link you up. If that was something useful. I've got a second point as well, Rex.
Yeah, by all means, we haven't actually explored that, and I wasn't actually aware of some of the implementation that we could do that. So by all means, I'd be happy to explore that further. Yeah, and have a look at what we could do with that.
Great. Well, shall I is that the email to link you? Okay, cool. And the second point is on what was the name of the scheme? The last scheme, the Community Shut the Road scheme?
Community Flood Signage Scheme.
Community Flood Signage Scheme. How have you reached out how are you promoting that currently to parish councils and town councils?
Yeah, so originally an email was sent out. This was a while back when we first took it on to all parishes and town councils using the generic contact information that we provided, but you can find them all online. We have done a lot of work with some of our county members to say, can you provide this information out to some of your public bodies during drop-in sessions? So we've obviously done a lot of drop-in sessions up in Bassetlaw following some of the flooding there. Yeah. A lot of drop-in sessions in Broxtowe following that, and this is also always something that we provide, but we do look to our members and the members in other districts and boroughs to pass on this message moving forward. So if you are aware of any different channels we can go down or any suggestions, would you
be happy to be linked directly to the parish clerks with a supportive borough councillor if the county member isn't doing much in that area? Could that be something you would be pleased to do? Would it be you? Or would it be just this email?
If it goes direct to the email, my colleague Josh manages the scheme and he'll be able to.
Community Road Signage Scheme, right?
Community Flood Signage Scheme.
Community Road, obviously. Community Flood Signage Scheme. Only because I've had a resident wanting to shut a particular road yesterday with me, and he did have a reasonable reason. It was exactly that point: cars going along, flooding his property because of the brake wave, whatever you call it, bow wave. Yeah. So yeah, I'll email you on both those matters then.
And the town and parish forum here would presumably be a fairly good place to spread that message. Councillor Chewing.
Be very quick and mindful of time. Thank you for the presentation. Some very useful information there. Just going back to what Councillor Grocock mentioned about spreading the word. I'll certainly be raising it at the Town Council in Cochrane. I'm sure Richard will be as welcome. I'm sure I can think of one road, certainly Hollygate Lane, that could be closed.
Yeah.
Could we ask for yourself, Kath? Could you share that to all? I think you've got details of all the clerks, haven't you? Could you just pass that through so then it will be really useful? I think you'll get quite a lot of volunteers and it could be really impactful. So thank you.
Sorry, Chair, through the chair. It was quite a sort of it seemed a bit of a hodgepodge, really. And there's there's hundreds of parishes, not hundreds, but there's lots, and probably is hundreds actually. Huge number of parishes across the county, and I noticed it was only some of the real bigger ones represented there.
Yeah, so if I just dab in a little bit, so it traditionally was sat with our emergency planning colleagues who unfortunately did not have the resources to promote it. So we took it on last year, and we went from 2 schemes to 18 schemes over the year, and we've gone from 10 wardens to I think 150 now. So we are slowly promoting it, and that's what we're trying to do. Some of the larger areas that flood consistently are the ones that come up on there. So your Crockwell butlers who face it on a weekly basis. The main challenge we find is just we need to ensure we've got the volunteers. So if you are aware of those communities where you can have 3 to 5 volunteers, and that's great. Sometimes we have the issues where there's only one person who may want to be involved. But what we do see is town and parish councillors who join on to be the flood warden. So it's not necessary, but it can be anyone. It can be. We would ask that they're probably 18 or over, but honestly, it can be anyone from the community who want to help. It doesn't have to be someone who's on a councillor, but we do obviously see it. It normally sits well with them.
There is the potential for a conflict of interest though. So this guy, I'm pretty sure would shut the road at the first sign of a 2-inch puddle. So I suppose there's some sort of scrutinous process that they go through in order to make sure that they can do it. Because if he's got the kit, he might then ignore the rules you've given him and just go out and do it.
Yeah, they've got specific thresholds that they have to work with. So we sit down with via East Midlands who understand the road network and say, okay, once it hits this point, this road will be impassable. Whereas the safest point, we can shut the road, that road users can still get around. If we found out that they were doing something probably against the policy, then we would have those discussions. But we haven't seen it yet. So touch wood that it wouldn't happen.
Just say that there was on the news this week, on the local news, about the road closures and the communities being involved in that.
One of the sort of constant difficult things to suss out often in the areas that I'm aware of, it's the same half dozen places that are worse affected, and it's not easy getting to the bottom of why that is. I spent a couple of hours bucketing water from my neighbour's garage last night, and inevitably your mind casts to we've moved a hell of a lot of water here in the last couple of hours, and I can't understand why it's not going down and where the rest of it is coming from. What advice do you have for us in terms of trying to get to the bottom of where the issues are, particularly in relation to what you've explained there, that if it's Severn Trent's asset, then we need to be trying to knock on their doors, but if it's your asset, we might not. But to us as lay people, that's often quite impenetrable to understand, or perhaps there's a bit of a problem with linked issue with one to the other. How can we try and get at that better?
Without trying to inundate myself and give a bit of a cop-out answer, the best response is to contact us directly. So we see a lot of issues at hand where people don't understand where the issue is at hand, and that's what we've got officers on the ground for. So we've got land range officers who have years of experience undertaking these investigations to go out on site. They're pretty much out on site every day, 365 days a year, bar Christmas. So they're really well trained to understand what's going on. So our advice is to contact us on that email address, and we can liaise with yourselves and the residents. We can go out on site, we can do those investigations. We have access to maps that the public wouldn't have access to. We've got direct links to colleagues in different authorities where they might not be able to get to those colleagues, and we can have those frank discussions with them behind the scenes to say, look guys, we know there's an issue here, how can we solve this? we know that on the face value they might get a different response if they went to their generic customer service line. So we've built those relationships up so we can manage this moving forward. So my ask would be that if you are aware of any concerns or you've got residents who repeatedly flood, please do let us know and we can do those investigations and we can work with you where possible to involve you to make sure that you're aware of what's going on as well. But ideally, it would take a long time to explain a lot of issues and why they happen. So we'd much prefer to meet you on site and talk through it on the ground so we can actually show you what's going on. That's probably the best way forward.
Councillor Way.
Thank you for that presentation. And just to reassure you that our parish clerk has had your email and is currently appealing on the local Facebook group for some volunteers. So that system's working. With reference to what we were talking about earlier, what sort of influence or responsibilities do you have regarding SUDs on these privately managed estates? Because if they're not working, which I've seen some of, I don't understand the complexities of this, but it appears that it's affecting somewhere further down the system. Do you have the authority to go in and look at these and ask them to do something?
Currently, and there will be a nice caveat at the end, so I'll say the bad to begin with. Currently, no, we don't, unfortunately. There is a bit of a break in the legislation, so the local planning authority has a responsibility to ensure it was built to its specifications, but moving forward, if there's issues, they're not responsible for that. The good news, however, though, is the Flood and Water Management Act back in 2010 had a specific schedule to it, referred to as Schedule 3. It was never enacted, and that was specifically to make the local authority responsible for adopting all SUDs in new developments. The new guidance has come forward that they are now looking to enact that. So in the past 6 to 12 months, they've been working behind the scenes with all the authorities to discuss how this would work in practice. It was unfortunately delayed this year. It was supposed to go through, but ministers delayed it for some unknown reason. But it is still looking as something that will be enacted in the next, I believe, don't quote me on this, 12 to 18 months or so. So there'll be a new way moving forward for local authorities to adopt all SUDs on properties. But this will need to be a new team that's set up. There's a lot of work in the background that needs to be done on the statutory basis. So I can't give you too much detail on it, but I would advise, if you want to know more, look up Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, and that will provide you the background to what they're hoping to enact moving forward.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah, thank you. Councillor Butler.
Thank you. Well, as you know, Callum, recent and not so recent flooding incidents, we get reports from residents who are convinced that the reason why a road or area is flooding is because of water coming off fields, for example, which I'm sure is a problem. Just what sort of power, what sort of impact and influence can we have on the riparian landowners? Because I get the distinct impression that there are some who are, shall we say, responsible, and there are others who perhaps aren't. And I think we all know that we see the fields everywhere, and whether or not it's true in each individual case, claims are made that fields haven't been drained, cleared, and all the rest of it. What sort of influence and power can we have on the landowners?
Yeah, so we do have a schedule section, I believe, again, it's section 18 of the Land Drainage Act itself. So that allows the Risk Management Authority, who manages that area of water. So, for example, for riparian ditches, it is us, to serve notice on someone if they are not allowing the free movement of water through their asset. So if, for example, a farmer has not cut the vegetation in one of his fields along the ditch and it's causing the water to back up or go a different route, we do have permissive powers to serve notice on them, asking them to clear it. Traditionally, we don't, because we work with them first. So if you're aware of anything, if you come to us and say, this field over here, we find the landowner, we discuss it with them, we talk to them about their requirements. 9 times out of 10, they clear it within a couple of weeks, a couple of months. Unfortunately, sometimes it depends on if they're planting. The 1 time out of 10, we do have to serve notice. It is a long process, which is why we try to avoid it, but it will work eventually. But like I said, 9 times out of 10 is very positive. So if there are any concerns that anyone's aware of, they come direct to us. We do have the powers to force them into it, but we find that it's not needed.
Councillor Chewings.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, obviously, you make mention that Schedule 3 gets enacted. the SUDs will be taken in by the local authority. I'm presuming that's going to be yourselves as a county, also being the relevant authority. I think just we need to have note of that for the previous item we discussed when we were talking about the complexities of the open space and SUDs. Schedule 3 comes in place. That removes that requirement for ourselves and cost implication. Thank you.
Nevertheless, we said that you missed an opportunity to hammer home a point, Councillor Chewings. Yeah, indeed. So turning then, I think, to the very recommendations now. Recommendation A, I think we've had a pretty good go at. In terms of recommendation B, in light of the fact that we haven't had, quite understandably, the EA or Severn Trent Water back today, have you got a sort of specific suggestion about how we deal with that in terms of the recommendations before us?
Well, I suppose I'd suggest that we've had a couple of ideas, haven't we, about how we can promote some of the things that Callum's talked about to our parish councils. So we can take some outcomes from and the work with the careers hub. So there's some outcomes from that have come from this. But yes, you're right. Then we need the Environment Agency and hopefully Severn Trent Water to come to a future meeting when we'll likely have a similar recommendation, and it might be that then there's other things that we want to do with those organisations, and thinking again back to what Callum's presented to us tonight, and link all that together.
How straightforward is it? I think the suggestion would be that we ask for the second half of this evening that we didn't have to happen at next meeting in March. It's only 8 weeks away, isn't it?
So the Environment Agency officers said to me, can we come to your next quarterly meeting? I didn't confirm the date to them, so I'd need to check that with them, but they were keen to come. So I don't see that being an issue.
Everyone's happy with that. Okay, very good. Yeah. So I'm happy to move the recommendations of in the reports. Do I have somebody second that? Councillor Chewings, very good. Those in favour? Thank you. If you we've only got one item left, but we won't be offended if you take your leave at this juncture, I'm sure. Not that you should be bothered if we were going to be, but there we are. So that just leaves the work programme.
Yeah, very briefly. So we've got connectivity and communications in March, and we've got officers from the county council to come to that meeting to talk about it's kind of around broadband connectivity and things like that. So that we've got officers coming for that, and obviously we've just talked about adding the Environment Agency and Severn Trent Water, hopefully as well, to those conversations. And then we've got review of crematorium in July and a gap. So if there's any suggestions of anything that we want to bring back or bring new topics. And then October, we've got the infrastructure delivery item, which follows our last meeting when we had, I think it was the last meeting, Richard talking about the processes in place for working with partners to develop infrastructure plans, and then there was conversations about the actual delivery of infrastructure and how that's going to be monitored, what's the process for changing requirements and infrastructure plans, that kind of thing. So that's what that one in October will focus on, but again we've got a gap in October as well.
Councillor Grocott.
Would it be okay, Catherine, to request an update on development of the economic growth strategy?
Right now?
No, not now. For one of those gaps. Yeah.
Yes.
If other members agree.
Yeah. So I think.
You indicate. Well, what were you going to suggest, and then we can perhaps take a view on how to proceed. The obvious thing, isn't it? the two, where are the two? What, one in March and one in October? Obviously, with this is
July and yeah.
okay. Obviously, this is subject to the scrutiny matrix process that may or may not come forward for other items. But would you? We have to submit new matrices for each one of these. We're not masters of our own destiny on that front, unfortunately, are we? As we nearly found out at the last corporate overview group meeting.
Yeah, we'll need to submit matrices. I think there's a question for me about the economic growth strategy because it's going through the proposals that go through the strategic growth board as it develops. So it's whether that comes next year when we've had kind of a year of it being in place to scrutinise its delivery, I guess, rather than it now. But yeah,
I'm happy to be guided by you for which the best way you think it should be done. I think we provide good scrutiny in this group. That's all. But so it might be worth just having that extra. I know some of us are on the same group as well, but it might be worth just having that extra review. But I'm happy for that to be like the September one or whenever you think it's appropriate.
So we'll have a think about that when the best time to bring the open spaces bit back is. So I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you. It's quite a marathon.